Hi, I'm Meta Spencer, and today we're going to Costa Rica and we're going to talk to Tom Green about olivine. And if that mystifies you, just hang on. We're about ready to start. Hello, Tom Green.
Meta, thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have a chance to talk to you about how we are going to save the world with rocks and something like that, which I haven't quite learned the technology about, but I'm fascinated. And I'm fascinated by the idea that there's this stuff called olivine in rock, and that's what's going to do the trick. So you're with, by the way, I want to get something clarified because you have a podcast show, don't you? And you sent me some links and I was watching it. And there you were interviewing a guy from something called Vesta about exactly this topic. And you sounded as if you didn't know much about it yet, but now it seems that you are Vesta. So tell me how you have made that transition. Did you find out from this fellow that it was a good thing and you wanted to be part of it, or what?
That was a little bit of theatre. I already was quite knowledgeable at the time when I was interviewing one of our co-founders about the project, asking him to describe some of how it all works. I got involved a couple of years ago, and the reason I did so was because the climate is in crisis, and we need people to devote their energies to doing something about that. And it was something that I'd been aware of for many years, and felt that really now was the time for me to jump in and apply my energies towards doing something about the climate crisis. When I learned about this solution, which we call coastal carbon capture, I became extremely passionate about it because it is a nature-based way of removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, accelerating Earth's natural process, and has the potential to really scale up and make a difference on a planetary level.
Okay, I got more and more excited about it too, as I have listened to different people. I run a talk show, well, it used to be 5 days a week. I cut it back to 3 now, but lately quite a few have been about things like mineralization of, I talked to a woman who had spent time in Iceland capturing CO2 and pumping it down into basalt, I gather. And so I assume that there's some technological similarities, or that the chemistry of one has some bearing on the other. But I need I wouldn't say a thorough education, because I am not capable of absorbing a really thorough chemical education. I think I got a C in high school chemistry, so my potential there is somewhat limited. But the general idea I would love to know more about. So you're going to save the world by throwing rocks into the ocean, or not?
Yeah. Well, I mean, one thing I do want to say is that the climate crisis is really a very large problem that we've created for ourselves, over the course of the last 150 years or so. There's over 1 trillion tons of excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. That's actually, I believe, the equivalent of if you took the entirety of India and built a 40-story building over the entirety of India and filled it with carbon dioxide. That's the amount we're talking about here. So there's not just going to be one solution. We're not going to save the world on our own. There are going to be lots of different things that we need to do as a society to make a difference here. So to talk a little bit about the solution, and you mentioned some of the work that's going on in Iceland, and you're right that there is a similarity there. And the similarity is really that this wasn't our idea for how to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's the Earth's idea. So the Earth, through volcanic rocks, actually produces minerals which are basic or alkaline in nature. And these basic minerals have the capacity to remove carbon dioxide from the air. Now, the way the coastal carbon capture process works is we take these minerals, and olivine is this volcanic rock that's found all over the world. We grind it down into sand to make carbon removing sand. And then we spread that sand in the ocean in coastal waters. Once it gets there, it gradually dissolves in the water. And because it's an alkaline or basic rock, what it does is it reduces the acidity of the ocean. Now, the oceans are experiencing this major problem called ocean acidification. So the oceans are 30% more acidic than they were before the Industrial Revolution. And that's bringing marine ecosystems to the brink of collapse. You might have seen that in the news how corals are dying off or Dungeness crabs are dissolving because the water is now more acidic. So when we add this olivine sand, this carbon removing sand, to the ocean, it actually makes the ocean water less acidic, counteracting that problem. And in making it less acidic, we also enable the ocean to do what it does naturally, which is remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So that's how it works.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Okay, that I'm glad you referred to the acidification issue, because so many of the other projects that people have invented that may be good at, for example, I'm very interested in the brightening of the clouds. And that I think would reflect light, but it would do nothing to counteract the acidity in the ocean. Is that right? So anything that we can do to, but it's such a mess. I mean, the ocean is most of the world, you know, it's what is 70% of the planet is covered by ocean. That's a big lot of sand you're going to need. Let's get into that pretty soon. Okay, now you're going to take this olivine, which contains my birthstone, peridot. Is that what it is? I believe you're going to grind it up. Or do you need to grind it up? Suppose you just put chunks of it in the ocean. Wouldn't that do something?
It would do something, but we grind it up because we want this to happen at the right speed. So in the natural version of this process, what actually happens is rain falls on these volcanic rocks, and that very, very slowly removes CO2 from the atmosphere over geological timescales. Mm-hmm. What we want to do is speed it up so it happens over the course of decades. And in order to do that, we grind it into sand, because what that does is increases the surface area of the rock that comes into contact with the seawater enough to remove CO2 on these human relevant timescales, so we can really make a difference in the time we still have left to save the biosphere from the worst scenarios around the climate crisis.
Well, you started off with the right place, beginning with the commentary on why it's really important and we're in a hurry and we need to do something. The urgency of the situation is exactly, I mean, I lose a lot of sleep over the fact that we're not getting there fast enough. And while we're sort of on that subject, my particular grievance or issue that I find offended by is the commonplace comment by even people who are working on climate change that we should reduce our global emissions and get down to net zero, and then we can start removing it from the air by such means as you're proposing, in the air or from the ocean. Either one, I presume either one would work. Let's talk about that in a minute. But what bothers me is the notion that we do one thing first and then we get around to reducing it and removing it from existing locations that cause global warming. And I don't see why in the world we'd wait. Why aren't we doing both simultaneously and with as much fervor as we can muster for for whatever technologies are available and scalable right away. Speak to that. Am I wrong, or am I justified in feeling that this is somehow confused?
You're absolutely right. You're 100% right. Um, if we had started to reduce emissions several decades ago, and we were now close to zero emissions, it would be different. We would not need to do very much carbon dioxide removal from the atmosphere, but we didn't. And at this point, we need to both reduce emissions and remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. It's simply not a question of one or the other. We're in a situation where we absolutely need to do both. Now, part of the issue here is there's this trillion tons of excess CO2 sitting in the atmosphere today. If we stopped emitting completely tomorrow, that would still stay there, most of it for thousands of years, continuing to warm the planet. There's this analogy that's been used over time about a bathtub. Imagine you want to run yourself a bath and you want to fill the bathtub to, let's say, 2/3 full. So you turn on the taps and then you leave the room to go get yourself a cup of coffee. And then when you come back into the bathroom, you discover that the bathtub is actually overflowing and water is now pouring out onto the floor all over the place, making a big mess. Of course, you immediately turn off the tap, but you don't expect turning off the tap to result in the tub emptying. That just stops it from filling further. If we stop emitting now, that doesn't empty the tub, that doesn't empty all of the excess CO2 in the atmosphere. So carbon dioxide removal is an imperative unless we want to live in a world with a lot more famine, drought, flooding, and other forms of extreme weather than we are experiencing today.
Okay, now there are people who will say, and people who should, I think, know better, who will say, but listen, if you go around telling people that you can actually remove carbon from the atmosphere or from the ocean, I don't know whether you're going to call it carbon removal from the ocean, but at any rate, you sequester the stuff. If you tell people that we could undo some of the work that we've already done by our big mistakes, people will think, well, you can just go ahead and admit it. And in fact, there are these things called offsets, so that big corporations kind of pretend that they're doing something good for the world by buying offsets, which is just paying some other people to do some removal instead of doing it themselves, or reducing emissions. And that this is a moral hazard, and you mustn't create a thing that's going to tempt people to do the wrong thing. So don't tell anybody that we could remove it from the air. Shh.
Yeah, absolutely. People like to talk about the moral hazard. Well, if people know that we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere, then they'll just keep emitting. Here's a clean little secret. Fossil fuels, which of course are the main source of emissions, are actually now more expensive than renewable energy. Powering our world, mostly from renewable energy, is fast becoming the cheapest way to generate electricity, to generate the energy that we need to power our lifestyles, our economies, everything about what we do. So the transition to a world filled with clean energy is financially pretty much inevitable. But what is not inevitable is the speed at which that happens. And that's where we need other things. We need governments to step in and make sure that we end subsidies for fossil fuels and that we have more subsidies for renewable energy in order to accelerate that transition. And we need carbon dioxide removal to help us with a couple of things. One is we're just not cutting emissions fast enough. I mean, we're not even cutting yet. We need to, first of all, stop the growth of emissions and then start cutting. So we need something as a stopgap measure in order to get us through this transition period. And we need to deal with the fact that the bathtub is full, and someone needs to take half of that water out of it by effectively pulling the plug. And carbon dioxide removal is the way that we need to pull the plug.
Mm-hmm. All right. I'm on your side. Absolutely. Now you have to convince me how efficient and effective this is and whether it can be done on the scale that really will make any difference. I frankly was very skeptical. I frankly still am, that you can haul enough of this rock and grind it up and spread it on beaches and get people's permission to spread it on their beach around the world quick enough to make much difference.
Well, your skepticism is very healthy, and I appreciate it, right? Because if we all just believed the first thing we heard, then we'd all believe all the fake news we see on social media, and we wouldn't be discerning about which solutions really can make a difference. So I appreciate your skepticism. That's probably the place to start. One thing I want to clarify about how this process works is that we're not actually talking about putting sand on beaches. The sand needs to be in contact with water in order to do its work. And so what we're talking about here is spreading the sand in areas of the ocean that are adjacent to coastlines. And that's where this action happens. So when sometimes when people say to us, well, who's going to give you permission to do this at, on my beach, right? The sort of NIMBY idea, not in my backyard. We're actually not running into that so far, because when we talk to coastal communities about this, what we hear from coastal communities is that they need sand, that they are experiencing sea level rise as a result of the climate crisis, that they are experiencing falls in the yield from the ocean because of ocean acidification, that they're seeing stronger and stronger storms coming through every year because of the climate crisis, and that actually they like the idea that if we add extra sand to the ocean, then that can provide some protection against the erosion that they've experienced. So coastal communities are really on the front lines of the climate crisis, and what our ethos really is to work with coastal communities to put them in the driver's seat, and really only to do this in places where coastal communities actually are desiring it. The other question you asked is around scale, and as I mentioned at the beginning, one of the things that really started to get me most excited about coastal carbon capture when I first heard about it was the potential for scale. So the National Academies of Science just came out with a report in the US looking at different ocean CDR, carbon dioxide removal solutions, and they independently said, so this is not me saying it, they independently said that they believe that this could achieve greater than 1 billion tons a year in scale. And so we've got external assessments saying that this could be big enough to really make a dent in the overall human emissions. In order to bring this to that kind of scale, we'll need to take a lot of olivine, grind it down into carbon removing sand, and spread it over large areas of coastal waters. By our calculations, in order to remove 1 billion tons of CO2 from the atmosphere, we'd need to spread carbon removing sand over less than 0.25% of the area of the Earth's shelf seas. So that's not 0.25% of the Earth's oceans. That's just the continental shelves that are around the land masses. So there's plenty of area available to do this, and there's also plenty of olivine minerals in the earth for us to use. In fact, this is a mineral that makes up 50% of the upper mantle, so it's one of the most abundant minerals on Earth.
Now, this is normally found in basalt.
Yeah, so basalt is a form or multiple forms actually of volcanic rock, and olivine is another form of the same family of minerals, and often they're found next to each other. So, for example, if you go to Hawaii and you go to the Big Island, which of course is a volcanic island and a relatively recent one, you will find that is made of basalt, and you will find areas of olivine, and you can actually just look down on the beach and pick up olivine, from under your feet.
Okay. Now, the question there is, I assume that the real issue is how much energy it takes to extract the stuff and crush it and transport it and spread it. How much CO2 emissions you're going to produce in doing that, and of course the cost. I guess the two factors would be the cost and the energy expenditure. So convince me of that.
Yeah, the energy expenditure and the cost are two very important things to consider, and I'm glad you asked about them. So in terms of energy expenditure, we've done a assessment which they call an LCA, or a life cycle assessment, which is looking at how much carbon dioxide do you emit in the process, and then how much do you remove. And what that has shown is that this process could be up to as high as 97% efficient, meaning that for every 100 tons of carbon dioxide we remove from the atmosphere, we only emit 3. Now, of course, that depends a little bit on different situations. How much do you grind it? How far do you transport it? And so on. So it varies, and sometimes it's a little bit less than that. But the analysis indicates that this is a strongly net negative carbon impact. Now, you've also got the cost. So we estimate that once we bring this to scale, we can do it for something in the region of $25 to $50 per ton. Now, if you've looked at buying carbon credits, then you may have seen that there's a very wide range of prices at the moment for different types of carbon credits. And one thing that's very important to note when you're looking at carbon credits is the question of permanence. So when we remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere through coastal carbon capture, that carbon is stored permanently in the ocean, meaning when we say permanently, we mean for at least 10,000 years, maybe up to 100,000 years.
It's good enough for me.
Right, yeah. I mean, I'm planning to live forever, but so we'll see what happens. What's very important, though, is that if you're paying a forest owner not to cut down a forest this year, then that is a very different thing. That's a lot more temporary. Or even if you're planting a new forest. And by the way, I love trees. There are lots of reasons to preserve forests and to plant trees, but this is short-term storage. And as we've seen, I'm from California, as we've seen there with the fires, forests can go up in smoke. So permanent forms of carbon capture are generally a little more expensive than some temporary forms of carbon capture, but there's a reason for that. They are permanent, and that's what we really need here.
Who's going to pay for it?
Fantastic question. Thanks for asking it. So, at the moment, the way that carbon removal is paid for, certainly in the US, is generally on a voluntary basis. So this is corporations basically saying we want to be net zero. So they reduce their emissions, and then for the emissions that they cannot reduce, they purchase carbon removal. And there are thousands of companies now, actually, just in the US alone, that have pledged to be net zero. And the number of companies making that pledge trebled in just 1 year, from 19 to 20, or maybe it was 20 to 21, I can't remember. But the growth in companies that are taking that stand and becoming carbon neutral is really heartening and is wonderful. So companies are buying carbon credits carbon removal credits in order to meet their own net zero goals. Now, they don't have to do that. That's voluntary. And a lot of consumers are doing the same thing, of course. um, deciding to offset their emissions for the year, or their emissions from taking a flight, or whatever it is.
Mhm.
What we really need, though, is for governments to step up. So what we need is for the U.S. government and other governments around the world um, to take their countries and follow the example of countries actually like Costa Rica, where I am now, which was the first country to have a nationwide net zero pledge. We need countries to step up and um, and institute policies that will result in dramatic reductions in emissions and removal of carbon dioxide. Doing things like tax breaks for carbon removal, requiring companies to be net zero, and so on. It's kind of interesting, because sometimes people say to me, "Oh, climate change, it's such a huge and difficult problem to solve, and it's so multifaceted." And I say to people, it's not that hard. All of the technologies that we need to do this already exist. What we need is, and all of the government policies that we need already have been envisaged. What we need is for governments to get together and actually do that.
Bless you. Absolutely. I 100% agree. And I'm concerned that this isn't happening. One of the things that I find when I start talking about such things is people say this evil word, geoengineering. And once you say that word, the game is over, because everybody knows that geoengineering is bad, and that's all you need to know, and so on. So I imagine you are being called by your enemies a geoengineer. And so I think we have to get some kind of public relations campaign that's going to change the discourse about this notion of negative emissions technologies, right? How
Yeah,
do you counter that? Do you run into that when you try to go make a pitch to somebody and they say you're a geoengineer, get out of here? Don't want to see you.
when we explain our solution to people, generally they find it actually very intuitive, very compelling. It wasn't our idea, it was the Earth's idea, as I like to say, right? This is a nature-based solution. Now we're taking nature and we're doing it faster, right? But that's just like farming, right? When people came off the plains and moved from a hunter-gatherer society where they were taking fruits that were growing anyway and actually put them in rows and planted them, they accelerated nature. And nobody says today that we shouldn't be farming on a planetary as a planetary society. So usually when we explain the solution and how we're accelerating nature, people get pretty comfortable with it. The reality is we've been changing the climate in a negative way ever since we started taking fossil fuels out of deep geologic storage and putting that carbon in the atmosphere. That's geoengineering.
I love that analogy. Yeah, it's true. It's more than an analogy, it's reality. Okay. Well, tell me some of the other thing is people will say, well, when you start tampering with nature or doing these strange things, and some things do put me off. Like I would be a little nervous about spraying sulfur into the stratosphere, because indeed the argument there is you don't know what might happen. You don't know what the side effects may be. And I think that's true for some things. So it is important to think about the negative potential consequences that we hadn't anticipated and try to anticipate them. What might go wrong with your technology?
Yeah, I definitely agree that it's important that we look at the consequences of everything that we do. And one thing that is very different about what we're doing compared with some historical ways that people have intervened in natural ecosystems is that we're not introducing a new animal or a new species somewhere where it hasn't been before, where it might suddenly start, you look at something like introducing the cane toad in Australia, and it has decimated the local, populations of amphibians, and there's no way to stop that, right? It is going to replicate. What we're doing is we're introducing an inert mineral. So that inert mineral is not going to sort of multiply and take over the world. We can we're starting with small pilot deployments where we'll be measuring absolutely everything that happens, taking detailed ecological surveys, really examining the effects on the ecosystems in great detail. We'll do that on a small scale first. And if we see negative impacts, then, of course, we won't scale up to larger scales. And if we don't see negative impacts, and maybe even we'll see positive ones because we mitigate ocean acidification, then we'll go to the next level of scale. We'll go from 100 tons to 1,000 tons, and from there, if we see good results, to 10,000 tons and so on. And, this is really, to us, the only responsible way to do this is by starting small, measuring everything, and then gradually scaling up from there.
I would assume that any negative side effects would be local. In other words, you're spreading this sand in a particular area, and it might be it changes the chemistry of the water, and the fish or the mollusks or whatever can't cope with the changes or something of that kind. So maybe you could de-intensify the amount of sprinkling you do in any one location or something like that, so as to reduce the intensity of the effects. I'm just thinking of how you would make sure, because I don't think that anybody would say if you sprinkle it a little bit around Hawaii that it's going to do anything that's going to change the weather patterns in the Atlantic or something. Are there people who are there reasons to worry about global effects of these local interventions that you're making?
No, there really aren't. The places where we put the sand in the water is where we're going to see the effects, and of course that's where we're going to be measuring everything. You mentioned Hawaii, by the way, and I know I talked about it a little bit earlier. Hawaii is one place where we're not planning to add extra olivine sand to the water because it's already there. And so that's actually a place which is where the sand is already naturally removing CO2 from the atmosphere. And it's a place that we're studying because it provides a natural example of what we are planning to do. The other thing that I want to talk about here in relation to what you just brought up was changes in ocean chemistry. And so one thing that's very important to understand about coastal carbon capture is when you sprinkle olivine sand in the ocean, it's not like sprinkling, let's say, salt or sugar in the ocean, where it's sort of what you can imagine it would sort of dissolve immediately. This dissolves over the course of many years, even decades. And so any changes in ocean chemistry happen very, very gradually. And of course, the ocean is this open system with water swirling around and washing in and out and so on. And so the impact on ocean chemistry because of this gradual dissolving is going to be very, very minimal. And that's what we want, right? If we don't want to do anything drastic here. What we want to do is subtly and slowly and gradually change ocean chemistry in a way that will remove CO2 from the atmosphere without causing any big perturbations that could have a significant impact on marine ecosystems.
Well, I don't know. I mean, maybe, but I can think of places where you would like to hurry it up. I'm thinking, for example, I did a talk show with a guy in Australia about the Great Barrier Reef. And he's trying to get going with a project that will brighten the clouds over the Great Barrier Reef and therefore cool the water in the area. And this would be the temperature would change from one day to the next, I think. So the idea would be to have an immediate effect if possible, because those corals are dying, by the hour. And so it would be nice if, have you thought about where in particular you'd like to start with sprinkling your olivine sand, because the local conditions are such that you'd want as quick a reaction as possible in a particular area, like, for example, the Great Barrier Reef.
Well, that's an interesting point you brought up, and I don't want to I don't want to say what other people should be doing with different approaches and different technologies, but just in terms of our approach, the olivine sand will dissolve gradually anyway, and we see that as something that quite simply means that we will not be having a dramatic impact on ocean chemistry. If other people doing very different things want to have a more rapid impact, then I'm sure that they're looking at it looking at that for very good reasons. In terms of where we would like to do this, we are currently exploring the idea of different pilot deployments in a few different countries around the world, both in the US and abroad. We're actually engaged with a number of different sites along the eastern seaboard of the US. And we're also actually having some conversations about doing this in India. One advantage of places like India is that the warmth of the water increases the speed of the reaction that happens here, and therefore increases the speed of carbon capture. It's still on the course of years to decades, you understand, but just helps a little bit. We wouldn't want to do this in sort of Arctic waters where it would happen more slowly.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are other people who have ideas for the Arctic. The cloud brightening is my vote. That's, you're right up there with cloud brightening at the moment in my thinking, because I prioritize. I just wrote an article with a list of a dozen ways of doing some kind of net emissions reduction. And so I'm constantly comparing what might work and what seemed to be kind of wishful thinking or hard to imagine how it could be implemented. It sounds like you're on to something, although I must say it's really surprising if you say that little, that changing the water off that little of the world's coastlines will have that much effect. My goodness, that's very surprising to me. Tell me more about the chemistry. How does it again work? This stuff, the sand, chemically does what to repeat the process, because I have trouble retaining exactly how this is going to work.
Yeah, and for those people who aren't experts in geochemistry, don't feel bad if it takes a little bit of time to understand it, because it can seem a little complicated to begin with. Sometimes people ask us the question, well, is the carbon dioxide being stored in the rock? And it's actually kind of the opposite. The rock is dissolving in the ocean water, or the sand is dissolving in the ocean water and making that water less acidic. And when ocean water becomes less acidic, it increases its capacity to store carbon dioxide. So what happens then is carbon dioxide is stored in the ocean water as a molecule called bicarbonate, which is actually essentially baking soda. And carbon dioxide then leaves the air and enters the ocean water. And it's all because the sand dissolving in the water makes it less acidic. That's really the key to this. You mentioned only a small area. It's a small proportion of the total area of continental shelves, less than 0.25%. But the Earth is big, and that's still a significant thing that we need to do. 1 ton of carbon removing sand removes roughly, or just a little less than 1 ton of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So to remove 1 billion tons of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we need 1 billion tons of carbon removing sand. That's a lot. We don't want to pretend that that's not a large amount. But when you compare that to the scale of things like the coal industry, the aggregates industry, other industries where we are moving a large amount of material around the world, it's much smaller than those. So it is something that is on a scale that humanity can certainly achieve.
So you're saying that the amount of this stuff you need to haul around is less than the amount of coal that is being hauled around now. Okay.
Absolutely.
Well, now look here. I've got a plan for you, because it seems to me there's this senator from West Virginia, I think, who is holding up the progress in the U.S. because he wants to protect coal miners' jobs. Why don't you give some jobs to these coal miners hauling sand around the ocean?
We would love to do that, and I mean, in all seriousness, there is genuine economic opportunity here. This is the extraction of minerals, the grinding, moving things around, setting up all of the supply chains and all of the monitoring to do this on a large scale will result in significant economic activity, and I think that's part of a broader message as well, that I think that we've been gradually learning about how to react to climate change and the climate crisis, which is that this isn't all about giving things up, right? This can be about the creation of new industries, like the solar industry, like the wind power industry, and like the carbon removal industry, which is now attracting a lot of investment and is starting to employ more and more people.
Okay, I'm trying to visualize what would be involved. You're going to locate a place where there's been a volcano, because that's where you've got your olivine. And it's always right where there's been a volcano, or is it scattered around in different places too?
Well, it is always where there's been a volcano, but some of those volcanoes are pretty old, so you wouldn't necessarily think of it as an area that is currently volcanic. So, for example, North Carolina in the US, most people don't think of that as an area that is highly volcanic, but it is an area where there are deposits of the mineral olivine. So we locate an area where there are deposits, and there are deposits in many countries around the world. As I mentioned before, it's a very abundant mineral. So there are deposits on every continent, in many countries, in many states of the US, for example, and
inland as well as on the coast.
Inland as well as on the coast. Absolutely.
But you want it on the coast. You look for deposits near the ocean, near where you can sprinkle it.
Yeah, exactly. Because as you imply there, if we can extract it relatively near the ocean, then we have to transport it less far, which involves less carbon dioxide emissions in the transportation process, and so that improves the net negativity in carbon terms of this whole process. So we locate it somewhere, preferably near the coast, as you said, grind it down into sand, transport it to the coast, and then spread it typically by ship in coastal areas. And then, once it's been spread out, as I mentioned before, we do monitor everything very carefully. But once the sand is in the water, it's sort of a set it and forget it solution in a way. In that it doesn't require any ongoing maintenance in order to, this isn't a machine that requires maintenance. Once the sand is in the water, it will gradually remove carbon dioxide over time. And in fact, the more the oceans warm and the more the oceans acidify, and the more wave energy the oceans have, the faster this process works. So it's got this sort of future-proofed aspect where the worse climate change gets, the better this process works.
Say it again. The worse, why is that? The worse the climate change gets, the better this works? I'm not sure.
So we put the sand in the ocean, and as climate change gets worse, the water will get warmer, and the water will get more acidic.
Mhm.
And also the wave energy in the seas has been increasing with climate change. And as that continues to happen, the waves actually cause the sand grains to bump against each other, and that could accelerate the
Mhm.
dissolution of olivine and the carbon removal process. So with more wave energy, with more acidity, and with warmer oceans, coastal carbon capture actually accelerates and
Mhm.
happens faster. So the worse climate change gets, the more efficient coastal carbon capture becomes.
Oh, okay. That's encouraging, I guess. I mean, you don't want it to get worse, but then you do want it.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, in terms of um, the speed of this thing, um, how well? I'm not sure. How fast do you think that you can do this? And I guess the other part of it is the locality. With as I understand it, in the atmosphere, because the winds are always moving around, the amount of CO2 in one area, it doesn't vary too much. All over the world, it tends to be about the same concentration. Excuse me. Um, but I wouldn't think that would be true in the oceans because the ocean water takes longer to move from one area to another. So, do you find a considerable variation in the acidity of the ocean from one region to another?
Well, the ocean's acidity does vary from one region to another. That's absolutely true. Just like the temperature of the ocean varies from one region to another, although not by as much. Ocean acidity is more similar in different areas. When we do this, what will happen is the carbon dioxide will leave the air and be stored in the ocean water. And so then, as you mentioned, the atmosphere equilibrates relatively rapidly. So we could theoretically do all of this in one region of the world, and we would still reduce carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere across the entire atmosphere on a planetary level.
Okay. Yeah, now that connection is something I need to hear you elaborate. The connection between, excuse me, the concentration of CO2 in the ocean and the concentration in the atmosphere. Because, yeah, clearly it's the atmosphere that we're worried about the most, right? Even though, in a way, we're not, because the acidification of the ocean, which is increasing, is bad news in itself.
Yeah,
Right. So,
absolutely. Yeah.
yeah, how closely are these two things linked, and how long does it take to translate a change in the atmosphere into a change in the ocean concentration, or vice versa?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and so you're right, we care about both. We care about the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and we also care about the acidity of the oceans. And those two things are closely related. The more CO2 we pump into the atmosphere, the more of that will dissolve in the oceans as carbonic acid and acidify them. And that carbonic acid, that's the same thing that makes your fizzy drinks fizzy. So we're basically turning the ocean into a big fizzy drink at the moment.
Okay.
So what we're doing is when you add carbon removing sand to the ocean and you make it less acidic, what happens is we cause carbon to be stored in the ocean not as carbonic acid, but as bicarbonate, which is essentially baking soda. And that's a very important difference because bicarbonate is not acidic. So that bicarbonate gets locked up in the ocean water for 10,000 or 100,000 years. Some of it, by the way, can be used by corals to make their skeletons, or shellfish to make their shells. But most of it will just stay circulating in the ocean water. And by converting this carbonic acid, which is making the oceans acidic, to bicarbonate, which is then effectively permanently stored in the ocean water, what then happens is carbon dioxide leaves the atmosphere and enters the ocean water. So what we've done is we've effectively taken atmospheric carbon dioxide and turned it into permanently safely stored bicarbonate in the ocean. And that will then circulate for 10 or 100,000 years and circulate gradually around the oceans, over the course of, it takes a few thousand years for water to circulate in the oceans. So that will all gradually circulate. But what will happen is, because we've removed carbon dioxide from the atmosphere in one place, and the atmosphere equilibrates relatively quickly, we've then reduced the overall amount of CO2 in the atmosphere, and that will propagate across the planet.
Mm-hmm. Okay, but so in effect, the result of your intervention is going to be global as far as the atmosphere goes, but local as far as the ocean goes.
That is correct. Absolutely right. Yeah.
So you do need to sprinkle it in various places if you want to have a global effect on the acidity of the ocean. You shouldn't just do it all in one place.
Absolutely, and we're not planning to do it all in one place. We are planning to do it in numerous places around the world, and we're currently reaching out to different countries to see which countries are most interested, and to see which places, because every country is experiencing ocean acidification and experiencing the effects of climate change. And 194 countries signed up to the Paris Agreement to say that they were going to reduce emissions. And so we're reaching out to a number of different countries at the moment to see who is most interested in really being a leader in climate solutions. And, I mentioned India, for example, the US are two places where where we're working. And we're also talking to a number of other countries about their interest in doing this. And we welcome inbound. So if your listeners or your watchers are interested in bringing coastal carbon capture to their nation, then they should come to our website and reach out to us, because we want to make sure that this is available to as many different countries around the world, particularly those who want to play a leading role in climate solutions.
Perfect. Okay, now tell me more about where and how you do this. How close to the beach do you need to be? Are you like 100 yards offshore, or where? I don't understand where sand is found anyway. I mean, is sand isn't found in the deepest parts of the ocean, is it? On the bottom of the ocean floor, it's along beaches. Is that right?
Well,
and that's because it turns the waves and stuff, or not?
If you start at a beach, and you just start walking out into the ocean, you will continue to be walking on sand for a long way. So it's not just on the beach; it actually goes out into the ocean as well.
What, a mile?
Much more than that. Much more than that. Yeah,
Oh,
you'll find sand for a long way. The areas where this will work the best are on the continental shelves in less than 300 feet of water. So that the distance out that represents depends on where you are in the world. It could be only a mile in some places. This is better to do where it's a longer distance, so that could be 10 or 20 miles out. And so, for example,
say that again. It's better to do it farther out.
No, sorry. It's better to do it. It's better to do it in less than roughly 300 feet or 100 meters of water, of the depth of water. So if you go to somewhere like Hawaii, we talked about Hawaii earlier, the water around Hawaii gets pretty deep pretty quickly. And that's not what we're looking for. What we're looking for is places like the eastern seaboard of the US, where there's a significant continental shelf, which means that the water gets deep much more gradually. And so those are the kind of areas that work best for this. We can, depending on the exact coastal system, will determine how far out we want to be doing it. And so, we have, on our team, which by the way has, I think at the last count, 7, maybe it's now 8 PhD scientists. One of them is a specialist in what's called geomorphology. And that is really the science of looking at of coastlines, coastal systems. And so there's a whole science around what are the best places to put the sand, how far out from the shore, and so on, depending on that exact coastline.
Well, I have an idea. Everywhere there's a coast, I presume there are fishermen. And why don't you simply go to where the fish are being unloaded and say, while you go out there, we will pay you to take along this barrel of sand and empty it someplace out there and bring your fish back in, and Bob's your uncle.
Well, thank you for the idea. I love your creativity and your thinking about this, and certainly something that I will look into. Thank you.
Okay. Well, anytime. I have lots of ideas for you, and you sure have a lot of ideas for me too. This has been fabulous. Okay, so you now are in the business of trying to get people aware of this and convince them that it is a useful way to spend some money. How about getting to John Kerry? Has he heard about your project yet?
I don't know for sure. We have not spoken with John Kerry directly, but certainly I would love to discuss it with him.
Mm-hmm. Well, you're up there right in my category of saints already. It sounds like you're doing just fabulous things. And the other things that I put in the same category of feasible and attractive and really worth promoting. First is brightening the clouds, because I think that has real potential for saving the Arctic. And that is such an urgent place. I think the worst of the effects of global warming are going to happen on the Arctic Siberian shelf and the water. But then I also like this thing about carbon negative concrete. Do you know you have some folks in the Bay Area? You live in San Francisco. You ought to get acquainted with these folks who are doing the Blue Planet, I think it's called, making concrete, where they're going to take atmospheric carbon dioxide and turn it into concrete for the structures that we continuously produce around the world, like bridges and buildings and sidewalks and things. So I think maybe you're number 3 in my category of highly attractive ideas.
Well, thank you very much.
I would love to do what I can to promote this. So keep me posted.
Vesta, VESTA, and our website is vesta.earth.
Good. Blessings. All right, carry on. Project Save the World produces one of these shows 3 days a week and sometimes more. This is episode 388. You can watch them or listen to them as audio podcasts on our website, tosavetheworld.ca. Eventually, we even post the transcripts there. And when you get to the website, please look around, because we have conversations going on all the time about 6 global issues, plus potential reforms in governance, economics, and civil society. To find a particular talk show, enter its title or episode number in the search bar, or the name of one of the guest speakers. After you've watched or listened, scroll down and share your thoughts about the show with the other viewers. This is a place for dialogue, so please join in. See you there.